Good afternoon, or I should say good morning. Thank you for joining today. You're joining the Business Process Management Group of Georgia, part of the Technology Association of Georgia. And we'd like to thank everybody for taking time to talk about this important topic. Before I jump in, I want to give you a little bit of background on the Business Process Group. We've been around for a number of years, and for the last couple of years during the pandemic, we've been virtual. We are hopeful to get face-to-face and have had some amazing events over the course of the last 10, 15 years. Our focus traditionally has been on what the leaders of Atlanta and corporate leaders are addressing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's transformation, innovation, growth, dealing with bankruptcy. We've had some of the top thought leaders from our biggest brands here in Atlanta, and we couldn't have done it without our fantastic sponsors. Currently, the Coca-Cola Company, Comcast, the Georgia Terry Business School, GoProcure. Would also like to give a big thanks to the Georgia Hispanic Chamber. Without all of them, this would not become a reality, and they've been very supportive of our initiatives throughout the year. A little bit about myself, Raj Verma. I'm the chair of the Business Process Group. Have chaired this organization for a number of years. My vice chair, Sean Auerbach, has been one of the key board members driving the content and events, and he's an executive at Assurant. Finally, today I would like to go ahead and jump into the topic. As we mentioned at the end of last year in one of our events, that we knew that supply chain would continue to be an issue and something that we're all having to live and breathe through. Myself, I've been in supply chain for almost going on 25 to 30 years on the corporate side, on the consulting side, on the startup side. So I've been living and breathing it for a number of years. And I'm always reminded by the famous case study that took place in the late 90s. If you all remember, if you had an Ericsson and Nokia phone on a turbulent day, there was a storm that took place in Arizona, outside of Phoenix, where the only chip manufacturer for cell phones in the world that provided a Nokia and Ericsson, a fire took place. Nobody was aware, except for one person in Nokia who had somehow, some way decided to diversify their portfolio and find another chip maker. The long story made short is Ericsson waited till the fire was done. And as you can imagine, they never really managed their supply chain risk. They dealt with a lot of issues with the products, and Nokia grew from the ashes. So with that being said, today we're going to talk about the supply chain, how some companies are really performing really well, and we're very excited about the core group we have today and how they're keeping retail and everything full. And then we'll also talk about their best practices and some things that they're addressing. And as you're well aware, we'll talk about what are some of the causes. Everything. I think most people who have been part of different organizations are aware that due to the pandemic, the demand came down, thus the supply impacting manufacturing and logistics. Now you throw in the issues of fuel, inflation, and war. It makes this a very difficult situation that we're living through. But some of these great thought leaders are going to walk us through it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel, Sandra MacQuillan, who is the Chief Supply Chain Officer of Mondelez for the last 3 years. Prior to that, she had the same role as Chief Supply Chain Officer at Kimberly-Clark, was the Global VP of Supply for Mars and a Technology Officer for Mars. Extensive background, obviously, in supply chain and a global experience and a wealth of other experience, which Sandra will share. Juan Williams, who happens to be the Vice President of Global Supply Chain Services and Procurement Contract Management for the Coca-Cola Company, has been with Coca-Cola for a number of years. Also, prior to that, was the VP of Contract Manufacturing and the VP of Manufacturing for Sara Lee. So thank you, Juan, for also joining us today. John Trestrail, who happens to be the Director for Supply Chain at Newell Brands. And prior to that was Senior Manager of Supply Chain Optimization for Newell Brands as well, has a wealth of knowledge in supply chain, and we're very eager to hear what Newell is doing these days. And last but not least, the principal and host of Supply Chain Now Radio. Most of you, if you guys follow supply chain, if you're online or on podcasts, or you know the name Greg White. He's also a successful investor in supply chain and tech firms. also a venture partner in Kubera and a strategic advisor to many of us in the supply chain world. So thank you to the panel. We're very excited to hear your thoughts and how you're going to help provide some best practices to a number of people who are joining today. So why don't we kick off just with, what is your current role, your responsibility, and what you're actually targeted with from an organizational standpoint as it relates to supply chain. Sandra, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Raj, and great to be on a panel with everybody here. So my role is Chief Supply Chain Officer. That basically means that I look after from the shelf to the field, so procurement, manufacturing, logistics, engineering, sustainability, quality, safety, you name it, anything that sits in that technology piece, apart from obviously the R&D part of it, although I have worked in R&D in the past. I also have a responsibility to sit on the leadership team for Mondelez. So I'm on that executive leadership team, shaping the future of the company at the same time as making sure that our operations are running well. The kind of things that we're working on, well, obviously we're working on survival like everybody else at the moment with all of the work that we're having to do to manage inflation, transportation, the impact of the horrific stuff that's happening over in Eastern Europe with the Ukraine and Russia. And at the same time, we're also not stopping doing our strategic work on looking at step changing our planning transformation, step changing our relationships with our suppliers, and also looking at continuing to build talent and capability, because actually at the moment, talent everywhere is tired. It's been 2 tough years in supply chain. We've done amazingly well with our resilience, but this needs to be a continued focus to look after our people.
Thank you, Sandra. Juan, if you'd like to give us a little bit about breakdown on your current role and responsibilities as it relates to supply chain.
Yes, thanks, Raj. I'm a VP of Supply Chain Services in North America. So I actually sit on our North America supply chain leadership team, which is tasked, again, similar to what Sandra said, from everything from engineering all the way through from supply to the shelf through the commercialization process. My role primarily is in the procurement and contract manufacturing space, where we're looking at the asset right. We're going through the middle of pandemic, through these last 2 years. We're actually looking at continue on with our transformation of asset right, which is evaluating our manufacturing footprint. If you could imagine trying to do that right in the middle of the things that we've been faced with over the last 2 years, that's been a very big challenge for us. We're also focused very heavily on digitization, moving our planning and our supply chain to a more digital platform. Really focused on that over the last couple of years, and really expect that to really be a big driver for us going forward. And obviously the people aspect, that's been a very big challenge for us, likewise to I'm sure most folks on the panel. It's just been a very, very trying time for the organization, and really being flexible and working with that talent and our talent to really keep people engaged has been a challenge for us this year.
Thank you, Juan. Hey, John, if you'd kind of share the same areas, as Juan and Sandra has.
Yeah, for sure. So Newell Brands, not everybody knows our corporate name, but people know our products. Rubbermaid, Coleman, Elmer's Glue, Sharpie. We have a lot of great consumer products that are in everyone's household. So my responsibility is overseeing supply chain strategy and analytics at the corporate level to support our 8 different business units. That looks like supply chain network optimization modeling, where we're trying to figure out the right network to support our needs for our businesses. That looks like our data science team, which is doing predictive and prescriptive analytics, trying to figure out the best way to drive optimization and forecast accuracy within the business, as well as our BI analytics team, which is focused on reporting and bringing visibility to what's happening in our business and diagnosing why things are happening.
Great, thank you, John. And finally, last but not least, Greg, I know you have a a different view and optics of how you're looking at this. So I'd love to kind of get your take of your day-to-day responsibilities in this space, since it's a very varied area you covered.
Yeah, so let me start by saying I started where John and Juan and Sandra are. I was a practitioner at one time on the retail side for a major automotive retailer and a major mass merchandise retailer way back when. Since then, I've been a technology and service provider to the industry. So I've seen both sides of the table, both what we need and how we're getting it solved from a technology or services standpoint. Mm-hmm. And recently exited my last technology company and have moved into investing, but also into digital media. So I work with supply chain now, as you mentioned, Raj, and this is what we do. We interview and have discussions with the leaders in supply chain, identify new solutions and opportunities and challenges in the industry, and just kind of keep people up to date. But I got to tell you, it's a real honor to be on the same side of the mic with Sandra and Juan and John for the first time in a long time, and get to kind of share what I'm seeing from both perspectives as a practitioner and solutions provider, and as someone who gets to talk to really talented folks in our industry every single day.
Well, thank you, Greg. I'm also honored to have you on because I know you guys do an amazing job with your show. So as everybody who's listening today, and I know that will be probably downloading this in weeks to come, pretty extensive knowledge base, expertise. And we're talking about some pretty large brands. I know John mentioned and kind of went into a little bit more detail about Newell, and everybody is touching Mondelez, I know, on a very rapid base, but it's a big name. So let's talk about the consumer piece of this right now, because between Sandra, Juan, and John, your products have to get out there to the retailer, and they have to further go out there. So let's start with what's working well. Even though we're dealing with these humps, what do you see, within the organization to get your pieces out to the end customer that you've been able to walk through these challenges? And Juan, we could start with you.
Okay, yeah. For us, it's obviously working very, very closely with our customers and our consumers, and really understanding the SKUs and the items that they need and want on the shelf. And that's been our primary focus. And because when you're going through times as we've had over these last 2 years, and the supply chain hiccups and bumps that you've had, we've had to really focus on a more narrow portfolio, and not as broad as we had been doing in the past. And over time, we've really worked with those customers and identified what's moving best for them and the consumer, and that has been our primary focus. And we've actually had a very strong year last year and been able to meet and still getting very, very favorable feedback from our customers and the way that we've executed during the pandemic. So very, 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 very important to us to work closely with the customer and identify what's important and rationalize down to the things that are really important during this time.
Well, no, I appreciate you saying that, Juan. I know you probably can't get into too much of the weeds and some of the secret sauce, but I know you said that the customers help drive the portfolio that's going to exist out there. Can you kind of share? Was it a reduction in actual products that you went, or you changed your geographic footprint? Can you kind of give us some lens of?
Yeah, it was mostly, and not to go too deep into it, but just focusing in on the correct SKUs. We went through a series of SKU rationalization across our portfolio during the pandemic, in the initial rounds of the pandemic, narrowing down some of the items that we offered. We've exited a couple brands and that sort of thing during the pandemic so that we could focus on the right things as well as the customer.
Great. John, to you, same question. I know that, as you mentioned, Newell, the type of things you're bringing, and we all living with that Sharpie, right? I mean, that's something that you're going to find worldwide. So what's working for you to continue getting those products to your big box retailers to get them out? And have you had to make some of the same decisions that Juan's had to make, that, okay, we did X number and we're going to do X minus Y for a couple of years?
I think the thing that's been working the best for us, in my opinion, is our people. Our frontline workers in our warehouses and distribution centers don't have the luxury to work remotely. They have to be there and work under very difficult conditions. And they've been heroes for our companies, showing up every day, receiving our products in from our plants and vendors and getting them out the door to our retail customers. So that's been tremendous. We've seen sales growth, core sales growth over the last year because people want our products. They're at home more, and most of our products are for home use. So they've just been working very hard to keep the products flowing, and have been heroes for our company, helping us achieve that level of success. And second to that, everybody else in the company, whatever group it is staying laser focused on driving efficiencies and continuing to move Newell Brands forward in terms of improving, whether it be supply chain, sales, product innovation. Our people have really stayed focused and have been delivering great results for our stakeholders.
I appreciate that, John. And Sandra, same question to you. What's working well? You have a very large, and if you want to kind of share with our audience, because when people might hear Mondelez, they may not fully be acquainted with some of the very large global brands that you have. But have you had to make some pick and choices within those brands of, hey, these SKUs are going to go, these ones are not, and what's working well?
Absolutely. Yeah, Mondelez, if people don't know, because we call it Mondelez, but actually it's Oreo, it's Cadbury, it's Triscuit, it's Halls, it's the chewing gum, Trident. We've got a pretty diverse portfolio. We've got Tang for those who live in a different part of the world. There's the Tang powdered beverage that we do as well in Latin America and EMEA. So we've got a massive portfolio, lots of biscuit. So Lou in France, I mean, it just goes on. And we have a style that's local, but not only. So we have a matrix operation which has served us well, actually, because it means you can source more locally your product. The thing I would say is, just like John and Juan, it's been amazing to see the resilience of our people. They've just been of all the people across the whole of the organization, whether you're frontline or not, including sales and supply chain have been, having to be hand in hand on this one. We set ourselves a target of 25% SKU reduction in order to be able to focus really clearly on what we wanted to do with our supply chain in times where supply is short, and it's getting shorter actually if you look at how it's all working through. So we focused on both the supplier piece to make sure we could guarantee to get the raw materials in, and then we've also focused on, in partnership with the commercial side of it, how do we talk to our customers and consumers, because you've got e-commerce too, to make sure that we're actually doing the right things in terms of manufacture while we go through this reduction of SKUs. And it's an ongoing cycle. You have to keep reducing because people naturally, certainly the demand side of the business naturally wants to add SKUs, but we can't in this kind of situation. We've got to really focus on getting the lines to run brilliantly and continuously on the core product that the consumers want. So we're doing a lot of analysis with consumers and customers. We're doing a lot with our suppliers to make sure they can continue and they're all right in difficult times. And we're just making sure that we've got this huge focus on our people, because we need to look after them. They're doing a fantastic job wherever they are in the organization, and particularly the sales and the supply chain people.
Appreciate that, Sandra. I can imagine. And when you said a 25% cut on SKU, was that across the board of all the brands, or was it?
Yeah, no, all brands, everything, and of course that means that you look at the ones that you don't need. So it might not be so big for Oreo as 25%, but some of the other brands it might well be, because with Oreo we spend a lot of time in contact with consumers. Some of the others we probably come up with our own ideas which we may or may not need, and you then have to look and do the analysis and the data and the analytics to say, well, what should we be making? And then you can come in and cut, or you can build on that. But that's the target we set ourselves, and we declared it externally as well. So I'm really pleased, and that's the kind of stuff that really helps when you get it singing between commercial and supply chain. Then you're in a whole different game. Yeah. And where it doesn't, you can see it a mile off. Yeah.
So pivoting over to you, Greg, being somebody who's seeing all sides of this, what in your view, and I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit because you heard the word supply, right?
Mm-hmm.
And SKU rationalization, and specifically, we're in that area where, and I gave that example of the one global chip maker. I think you could anecdotally say that we see automakers are dealing with the same challenge. But what are you seeing in terms of people addressing the old adage of how to diversify their supply portfolio right now, making sure that their most important OEMs are surviving? How are they dealing with that make buy decision? Love to get your thoughts on what you're seeing as best practices you're hearing from so many folks.
Yeah, I think SKU rationalization comes immediately to mind because the inverse of that is SKU proliferation, which we have had in great measure, not by usually by anyone in the supply chain. I was in merchandising before supply chain. Usually we have a great idea and we just say, let's try this. And a lot of the let's try this has been extricated from the supply chain. Now you don't have 11 kinds of toilet paper since the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, right? You may only have a couple of SKUs. I think the other thing that companies have done particularly successfully is nurture their people and provide them with a safe work environment. I happen to know a couple of these companies pretty well that are here on the panel with me, and they've gone to extensive efforts to make their employees safe at work. And the other, one of the other things that I think is, and you alluded to this, Raj, is nurturing that supplier network. Early in the pandemic, I heard someone say eloquently and brilliantly, "It's too late to make friends now." So basically, if you've been screwing or disadvantaging your suppliers for decades, asking them for a favor when the crisis hits, it's all too late. Yeah. I've seen a lot of companies who have done both, nurtured that relationship prior to this, but also, as Sandra was alluding to, they continue to provide viability to those suppliers, even to their own short-term economic disadvantage, to make sure that those suppliers remain viable. That I have seen be really, really successful. And I've seen a turn early in the pandemic of companies realizing, even the ones who weren't that nurturing of their supply network, to be more so and to be more supportive in and out of crisis and recognize that. And further, to recognize that single sourcing, though it doesn't hit these particular companies as much as it does others, single sourcing through a particular supplier, a particular type of manufacturer, even a particular country or municipality, is really, really dangerous. And to start hedging their bets a little bit and giving, portions of demand to smaller, maybe what we would have called fill-in suppliers back in the day, to keep them viable as well. So when they need to ramp them up, they can do so practically.
Now, those are some great points, Greg. And it always takes me back to about 18 to 24 months ago. We had done an event partnering with UGA Business School and Avalon here in Atlanta, focusing on innovative ways to get a tighter relationship with your suppliers, your key ones, rather than just getting out the hammer and asking for 10% year after year, right? I mean, at some point, if you commoditize your supplier, then, as you said, they're not going to be around when the blank hits the fan, right? And this is the time you need them more than any other, and especially on the direct manufacturing side as you're getting products to consumers. So Greg kind of leads into the next way. What, and John, I can start with you, and feel free. I mean, this is a question that anybody can answer if they're comfortable, is what ways have you felt like you guys have been more innovative or transformative due to the challenges we're dealing with your suppliers, right? Not so much your own internal team, but what are you doing knowing full well that, yes, some of these guys may not have long-term cash, sometimes are can't get inventory. What have you guys taken a look at Newell, John?
Yeah, I think developing that strategic relationship is important. When you look at the principles of supply chain design, you've got to balance cost with service and resiliency. And if you're driving towards the lowest cost all the time, you're giving up quality, service, and the ability to withstand shocks in the network. So it's definitely that finding that right balance, because you're going to pay a bit more to have a diversified supplier base, but it allows you to withstand shocks like COVID or or hyperinflation or anything that we're experiencing currently. So I think it's really important for us to have tight relationships with our suppliers, work with them. In some cases, we have to work to like our tier 2 suppliers to make sure that they're providing the critical inputs and understand what the pressures are deeper down in the supply chain than just who we have the direct contact and contracts with today.
Juan, same to you. I think, being here in Atlanta for 20 plus years and having multiple relationships with the Coca-Cola company and how they've worked with their OEMs, I'm privy to some stuff, but I'd love to hear from you, what innovative ways have you been able to work with your key suppliers during this very interesting time we're living in? I think you're on mute, Juan. Juan, you're on mute.
All right, there we go. Yeah, I agree. I think we have done a lot in nurturing our suppliers and being creative in the way that we look at inventory positions, maybe where we have been tighter in the past, working through those inventory levels, allowing more and more within the supply chain, being very creative in how we address. And I'm not going to say, I would continue to use the word nurture and help them along as we go through this, because they have to remain viable. That's one of the challenges that we saw when we first got into the pandemic, when things were very, very tight. We realized right away that, through the great toilet paper shortage, we had to be creative in how we address that with the suppliers and working with them to build inventories and buy ahead and look at things like that to work through it.
Appreciate that, Juan. And I guess same question to you, Sandra. I know you just shared all the brands. You guys have global brands, you have global manufacturing, you have global supplies. So I think it's a constant movement with your suppliers, but is there anything that this current pandemic and the supply chain challenges we're living with in the market have had Mondelez take a look at how they're going to interact with their suppliers in new ways? Is there anything innovative that you guys want to share? I think Sandra, you're on mute. Sandra?
Yeah, I'm just coming off mute. Sorry. If I had $1 for every time I did that, I'd be very rich now.
Well, now we know it's a Zoom call.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So actually, I'll just slightly correct you on that one. Yes, we're a global company, but we're not global manufacturers. We actually have a strategy to make sure we're as close to the consumer as we can be, and even in the right place from a supply point of view as well. Because, when you do a supply chain strategy, you don't just look at where the plant should be from an asset point of view. You look at where the plant should be from a supply and a demand point of view as well. So you talk about a network then. You don't talk about just your plants. So we are a global company. Yes, we have global brands, but they are made locally or regionally for our customers and consumers. So that helps a lot, because then you can set your suppliers up to segment them to, are you a local supplier that we can manage with and talk to and help and support, and vice versa, locally or regionally? Or are you a global one that we need to, if you think of chocolate and cocoa, then that's clearly global. We need to look at that and say, and wheat and things like that. So how do we manage those differently, because you sit in a different bucket? So we've also done a lot of work on segmenting how we approach to understand that we've got the right approach for our suppliers, which then results in the fact that you can manage your network much better, because you don't just have one solution to everything. So we're moving more and more into multi-sourcing, but with the same high quality specification and recipe that we need, without having too many recipes and specifications, because that's the danger, that you then get very complicated up front. And we focus on SKU rationalization, but we need to focus on spec and recipe rationalization as well, to make sure we don't get too complicated, because that is wasted money, basically. But we also focus on measuring service with them. We measure inventory with them. And we have shared goals on what that should be at both ends of the supply chain. So it becomes a partnership versus just a buying relationship. It becomes much more about partnership of how can we have the right conversations with them. So those are the kind of things that we do. the metrics that we have in the supply chain start with the supplier, then they go, so you buy, you make, you move, and you sell. And those are the metrics that we try and pull out there, which means everything hopefully flows forward physically, but the data coming back is digital, coming back from the shelf.
I appreciate that insight, and also giving us the astute background of the close shore, where it's even though it's a tremendously large network, that you guys are doing everything close to the customer, which makes absolute sense. Greg, back to you. Seeing where we're at and a lot of changes that have been made, I know you and I have talked about this, that there's a potential of a ripple effect that potentially could start happening. We're seeing it in some places where certain suppliers are quickly making things. There's access to logistics to get it in warehouses. They're telling people double the demand, and we could be hitting to other issues. Are you seeing that in your that people are now starting to over adjust?
I'm hearing of it. Yes, I haven't seen it specifically, but I do hear frequently of companies who are going to face, as we've all heard or read about, the rules of the beer game, right? They're going to face the whiplash effect coming very quickly, and I think some companies are less exposed to that than others, because some companies, when they say we're going to hold just in case inventory, they just add time supply to everything that they are building or carrying or stocking or constructing. So there are other companies that are a bit more targeted in that, to identify varying time supplies based on the risk factors that are inherent in certain products or certain source materials and that sort of thing. And John alluded to that before. We can't just be focused on cost. We have to also be focused on risk. And risk, I hear a lot more people, this is a term I use, but I hear a lot more people thinking about supply chain more as a risk balancing exercise than a cost saving exercise. There is a lot of risk in using not tech or methodologies that are not long-term viable. And there are a lot of stopgap measures being put in place right now. Some companies have to really keep their eye on that and how they construct that sort of risk profile for being out of stock. I read an article about somebody who had even just a shoe store in New York, and had bought a year and a half supply, which of virtually every SKU, right? Which is dangerous. I think if you've done what Sandra and Juan and John have all talked about and narrowed the SKU base, then you have a lot fewer long tail SKUs that typically have lower but more erratic demand and are harder to predict. And when you put in additional time supply to try and cover better service levels, it's very risky, because it could take 2 or 3 times as much as a fast moving product. Fortunately, Oreos move really fast. I can assure you that I do my part to make sure that they do, Sandra. And likewise, Coca-Cola, and of course, certain SKUs of the Coleman coolers and other products that Newell that Newell has. But all of these companies have more long tail products, and those are very risky to bring in. So you have to be very careful. I do see some, I guess I would say, cavalier approaches to that currently. But I think a couple of other things. One, it's interesting that we talk about treating our vendors as innovation, right? Everyone here, your original question was innovation. I think it's more core value for the folks we're talking to here, but it is somewhat of an innovation to be good to your suppliers. And I think that's another point of view we've got to shift in supply chain. And transparency to innovation, by the way. Transparency and visibility throughout the supply chain are 2 words I hear a lot in both supplier side companies and buyer customer side companies, because that interactivity, that interconnectivity, that sharing of information that Sandra was talking about, that is so incredibly valuable to both parties. And it has been relatively rare to date in supply chain.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, we've seen this forever, and I know that I don't want to make a generic statement, but everybody in this group is focused on the consumer product, on the part, on the direct side. I came from a world where I had indirect under my umbrella, and that's a totally different ballgame, as they say, keeping the lights on with the marketing, advertising, landscaping, janitorial facilities, and sometimes those things and labor gets commoditized, and you start seeing the way that we, on the direct side, sometimes we're a little bit more engaged with the suppliers, but on the indirect side, hey, how many people can provide me office supplies and how many people can provide me contingent labor? I may not think as forward, as innovative and partnering as I need to, but the indirect conversations for a different day, right?
No, actually, no. Can I just disagree?
No, jump in.
Yeah, no, we focus equally on indirect, because if you look at where we're taking the heat at the moment, it's on transportation, it's on container shipping, it's on logistics, it's all that stuff that sits in indirects because it's not direct material. So I wouldn't assume that just because we haven't, I haven't assumed it's direct only. I've been talking about total, and maybe Juan and John have as well. It's not direct, indirect for us. It's the suppliers that we're talking about, and they could be from anywhere. And we have been trying to build our relationship stronger and stronger with our transportation people, which is hard because transportation at the moment, with the escalation in cost, it's their market. So that becomes quite hard. And you end up bidding with each other almost as companies to get this, and then you over ask, and then you've taken stuff out of the market. So it's a dynamic, particularly in North America, is a dynamic that we don't help ourselves on. But I am not talking about indirect. That's been hugely important in the last year, or certainly since probably Q2 of last year, because of the inflation that we're seeing and because of some of the issues that we had. If you think about the docks and you think about longshoremen and COVID and everything that happened there, it has been front and center. And probably we talked about it as much, if not more, in our system than raw materials.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Sandra. That has definitely been our case. And we've mentioned the great toilet paper war that happened. Well, that was, we were potentially, shutting down facilities and things like that because we didn't have that base material. So it really was a big focus for us in the indirect side and building those relationships and building on the great relationships that we've already had, but really making them more effective and communicating at a totally different level than we had in the past with those suppliers. So definitely critical. Same with the transportation, recognizing the ocean freight. Obviously, it's all in the news and everywhere, but that's been a huge one for us to work through. So I definitely agree with Sandra that's one that's front and center and definitely in a higher level of SRM and relationship management for the Coca-Cola company.
No, that's great to hear. With companies focused on those things, on keeping the lights on and the transportation. So that's a good pivot on the transportation piece, because that's something I was going to talk about in a few minutes, but I think it's a nice segue. And we all know the challenges coming out of most ports and dealing with the ocean freighter. How much have you integrated yourself with your team's logistics strategies, transportation, whether it's dealing with ocean freight, LTL, TL, anything else? How much more have you had to have changed within your organization than where it was coming into this? And John, we could start with you.
Yeah, we've always been very integrated into transportation and logistics within our strategic team. It's such a huge cost driver, right? So you really need to understand the cost of different modes of transportation, the trade-offs of those modes and the service that you get from them. We're a top 20 container importer into the United States. So the ocean freight market is particularly painful for us right now from an inflation perspective, but ocean shipping and international shipping, there's so many different levers that we can pull with transloading, port diversification, Asian consolidation, volume smoothing. So this is an integral part of my team's work, is looking at ways that we can adjust our logistics strategy and work hand in hand with our transportation procurement team, who is going out and negotiating with our indirect suppliers of transportation to know what's best and how to approach it in a way that brings the most value to us.
And since you've been dealing with the ocean freight, which is, everybody's having that issue, what has Newell tried to do to overcome that issue, to continue to keep the pipeline of products coming to your retailers?
A lot of it's just close relationships with our carrier base. We mostly contract with the vessel owners rather than through NVOCCs. We've been, we're a big importer, so we have a lot of leverage in most markets and good relationships. So I think working those relationships have been important. Listening to carriers in terms of where they want their equipment turned, right? So some carriers don't want their containers brought into the middle of the country because they want them back over in Asia. So is there an opportunity for us to strip out containers, in Long Beach area, so that we're not taking them into Kansas City or into the middle of the country, so the carriers get quicker turns on it? Just looking at different ways that we can be flexible, bring innovation to the way that we're bringing import volume into our distribution centers in a way that benefits everybody.
Great. Juan or Sandra, you want to maybe, I know, Sandra, you started talking about the transportation side, but I was curious about how you guys have had to pivot based on certain modes dealing with more backlog. Some have been open. How have you had to change it?
Yes.
You brought in new providers. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to go?
And you go, Juan. It's okay. I can follow.
Yeah. For us, it's been in North America. Obviously, the over-the-road transportation has been huge, a huge challenge over the last year or so. So what we've done is focus really on being the shipper of choice. I know everyone has talked about that, but really focusing in on how do we ensure that the carriers we are a location that the carriers want to come to, so that we are good freight for those carriers. That's been a big one. We've looked at changing our drop lots, looked at the way we treat the carriers when they come in, or the specific drivers into the facilities. So we've had a very concerted effort to drive to be that shipper of choice, and we're seeing very good results around that with the carriers and the primary tender acceptance and that sort of thing, really driving that by focusing in on being a good partner with the carrier. So that's been one of the bigger things that we've done, as well as putting the shipping on the correct mode, right? To ensure that we're either rail, and really doing a very extensive analysis around which mode is the appropriate mode, because there's been a lot of fluctuations within the different modes of transportation, in particularly in the U.S.
Thank you, Juan. Sandra?
I think another piece I would add, so I completely align with all the comments. The other piece I'd add is taking the responsibility internally to make sure we're being as efficient as we can in our loads, because we haven't been necessarily, because you haven't necessarily needed to be, and it's been more about the on time and in full, and on time is X, and you need to keep working it through. And what we've done instead is started to look at LTL versus where we want to be, and full loads, and can we do that with certain customers in terms of what we're doing, and then when we can we build that relationship out on drop size and all that kind of stuff. So it forces us to become more focused on how we actually run things, and it doesn't apply to the whole of the world. Let's be honest. If you're in a globe like you guys, John and Juan, if you're in global businesses, it isn't the same everywhere. North America is not good. Parts of Europe, moving aside from the war, parts of Europe are not as good as we would want them to be, but probably the worst one is actually North America still. And that's not just inflation and things like that. There's also, we know before we got to there, we know we had an absence of people who wanted to be truck drivers. They just didn't want to do it, So you've got this older generation that do, and then the younger generation don't. costs went up so maybe they do now because we're paying a fortune for people to do stuff. So there's probably a limited shelf life on that, but we knew we had we were bereft of the basic need in the first place, and this just basically made it worse, and then COVID set in, and people don't want to, and people can choose what they do, and that made it more complicated. So yeah, making sure we get the most out of what we do contract is really important for us to be more efficient as well for them.
Appreciate that, Sandra. One constant theme I'm hearing, and it's a labor question, which I'll get to in a second after I talk to Greg, because that's the obvious one, right? I mean, between remote work, people not coming back, the trucking, lack of labor, and also inventory and warehousing. Greg, any thoughts on what you're seeing? Because I know you're very tied in with logistics carriers. I know some of your conferences that you guys have held, and what are you seeing? Are there any changes of how these suppliers that are the ones living and breathing, whether it's in Savannah or coming out of China, that are changing the way that they're providing services to be more efficient or be more effective? Anything that you can see on the horizon that's going to kind of change the challenges we're seeing in transportation and logistics?
The immediate thing is pay, of drivers, and some of the conditions that Juan, that he alluded to, just better treatment of drivers. But look, let's face the fact that the driver shortage is not going to get better ever. 3.6 million more people of the baby boomer generation retired last year than we expected. The baby boomers were truck drivers, factory floor workers, that sort of thing. As Sandra addressed, the Gen X or Gen Z and millennials, they are not interested in driving. And I think that is true from what I've seen at any price. It's more a quality of life issue than it is a pay issue. So we have to accept that while it may not be immediate, autonomous is inevitable. And this is just my vision for how I see the transportation on the horizon. It will be a lot like shipping. We will have the trucks virtually autonomous on the roadways, and we'll have the equivalent of a harbor pilot that drives it through the godforsaken hellhole that is Atlanta traffic, for instance. And inside the perimeter, I can tell Juan has a decent sized commute. I can tell by the look on his face. But I think, we have to acknowledge these things. We don't want to because it's not necessarily popular, but I also think that because the world has changed, and I think changed for good, we can stop apologizing for the possibility that we're taking away someone's jobs in fulfillment, jobs in transportation, jobs in factories. People are staying away from those jobs in droves. And in many cases, they're not coming back. The 3Ds, as I call them, of supply chain are a huge deterrent for people: dark, dirty, and dangerous, or at least the perception of those things are keeping workers away and will continue to in the future. So we have to acknowledge that to be competitive, we have to embrace some automation there, and that includes in transportation.
Wow, thanks for being the one to touch the third rail, Greg. I really appreciate it. That's why I brought you here.
Well, I don't have a PR department, right? And I very well could be wrong. By the way, I have been wrong before, but and it certainly will be farther on the horizon than I think many of the disruptors in the industries believe it will be. But it is now at this point inevitable. We simply cannot compete, for instance, on reshoring if we don't automate, because we can't compete with $250 to $650 an hour in factory pay with the Chinese.
So I think now that we've exposed one other issue here, right? So it's like a crossroads of multiple paths that are coming at once. The pandemic, the people wanting to be safe, which totally is important and makes sense. Inflation, fuel, war. The issues of transportation, but now we got labor. It's been going on for a while now. We see it. One of my sister firms is involved in human capital management, and it's crazy. I mean, we can't. I'll personally interview 50 people to get one person to even get on my short list. It's been a very difficult situation. So let me ask that question. within your entire supply chain, whether it's transportation, whether it's warehousing, whether it's inventory, whether it's your procurement teams, your sourcing teams, what are you doing what models have you had to take a look at to keep people and to incentivize them to be part of your organization? And we can start with you, Juan. Juan's on mute. Juan?
Yes, I'm sorry. I had a little struggle getting off mute. Yeah, so I guess our big thing with our folks, obviously, we're dealing with a lot of the same challenges that everyone else is in the marketplace. But our big thing is flexibility in the way our associates work. We've been a lot more flexible. If their job allows them to work from home, obviously everyone's doing that, but we're really looking at that maybe ongoing. We've given support, an option to work with the leader that allows them to work from home, but also looking at that more hybrid model going forward, where we do create those opportunities for people to connect and celebrate, the successes that we have, and then to come in and ideate in person. So we're really moving more towards that, a hybrid type setup, and I think most folks are looking at similar things. But we have also revamped our learning and development. So we're trying to get that more built around the hybrid environment, where we're going to do more online education. Our Coca-Cola University, we're putting more emphasis on that to allow employees to get certificates from home and things along those lines that really have helped with the engagement. But those are some of the bigger things that we're doing right now. And obviously with our frontline employees, really celebrating their successes, because to everyone's earlier point, they have been the ones they have been the backbone through this whole pandemic and we've really celebrated their successes and recognized the great work that they've done over the last 2 years. So that's how we are looking at things here. Did you say something, Raj? I think you're on mute this time.
You're on mute, Raj, yeah.
I'm on mute that time.
Turnabout is fair play.
Yeah, exactly. Juan, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, Sandra, now, I know you started a couple of the discussions talking about how, the resiliency of your teams and how well they're working. But I guess, as Greg and everybody points out, there's a large chasm of talent, we're in almost every business function, and as large as your organization is, how are you addressing those, and what are the best practices that you guys may have, or not even best practices? What are you doing to address some of the gaps that impact virtually every part of the organization?
So very similar to Juan, as you'd expect from the kind of companies that are represented here anyway, with John and Juan and I. And Greg, obviously, but you haven't got that big a company in terms of the number of people. So I didn't want to miss you out, but
Thank you, appreciate it.
That's all right. So,
Greg, we're a party of one.
Yeah. Hope you're looking after yourself. That's what we should.
Yeah. I'm a great boss to me.
So if I completely agree with what Juan said. We're doing the same kind of thing, how to make sure people feel good. The other thing that we're looking at, which people might be interested in, is how do we take out the barriers to engagement and the barriers to execution in our systems and our processes internally? And if I think of, my life is more frustrating if I have to micromanage stuff, because everybody else has to micromanage stuff. So how do I put the right processes in place for people to have the right roles and responsibilities, and shorten the time it takes for them to get work to happen? Because that if people find their jobs are simpler to do, not easier, but simpler to do, then I think they want to stay and they want to do them. If it's really complicated and every day is really, really tiring because you have to go through so many different levels of protocol, of course you want to go and find an easier job. So along with what Juan's saying, we're also working on how do we simplify how we do things? How do we give more accountability down the business, more responsibility down the business to make people feel more valued in their roles, rather than everything has to come up, which historically most companies, that's how it works. But we don't need things to come all the way up. We just need to trust people. So it's building the systems to allow us to do that, and still get the visibility and the compliance, because that's really important in the kind of companies that we work in, of course, we have to make sure we're compliant and that we're delivering what we said we would deliver. So I would build that on to what Juan said.
Thank you. And John?
Yes, Sandra, I think that speaks to what we're doing as well. We've been rolling out a peak continuous improvement process and culture within our manufacturing DC operations. So those people that are closest to the operation, closest to the problems, are involved with the problem solving and decision making. And I think bringing that level of engagement to the front line really helps kind of with engagement, motivation, continuous improvement. And we're seeing the benefits of that, one small process improvement at a time. So that's been critical to our success, in my opinion.
Well, I appreciate that, John. So it opens up a thought. Sandra used the word systems, processes, efficiencies. We are the umbrella organization here is the Technology Association of Georgia. So let's talk about systems and technologies for a second. All of us who've worked in this space have partnered with, whether it's Oracle, SAP, Coupa, Ariba, exchanging, Microsoft. There's so many, and even larger players when we're talking about warehouse management systems. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but your relationship with your partners, have they been able to adjust and help you through the turbulent times that we've had with their systems? Have they come up with something innovative that allow you to be more efficient with your throughput, whether it's getting your parts and products out or paying your suppliers on time or doing supply chain relationship management? Have you guys been able to have that interactive support to your tech side? So anybody want to start, you can, but just made me think, since we're talking about tech, and it's one thing to have that relationship when things are stable, but what about now when things are, dealing with challenges?
Yeah, I think the access to data has been a game changer, right? So the cloud, central processing of large data sets, just being able to get at the data that was in the past kind of buried deep in ERP systems or in disparate operating systems, and being able to get to it quickly, have kind of democratized access to it, being able to apply algorithms and heuristics to it, and then ultimately visualize and create dashboards that are easily digestible within the organization. Like that's a game changer to me.
One of the things that that we're looking at too is our bots, right? So where you're looking at some of the routine things, the mundane processes that we may have in some of the organization, and really implementing more and more of those bots to take away some of the redundant or the mundane type activities, to redirect some of those resources to other more productive activities. So we have a pretty big push on that in different parts of the organization, and really are seeing some very good results from implementing those bots to help in a very practical and pragmatic way help the business.
Yeah, very, very similar in terms of what we're doing. We're also looking at, we're actually doing quite a bit of work on transparency of supply chain. We're using a couple of brands to enable consumers to be able to look back into the supply chain and see where their products came from, which is proving to be really interesting. And I've conversations with my team about how do we get to a place where we have a lights out factory, a lights out DC, and at the same time increase and it's never quite lights out, is it? So people don't need to panic that there's no jobs, there are. But the concept is really important. And if you can then do that and show the consumer the data of where their product comes from, you then can win against the customer, so against the other competitors that are in your system, because they can trust more easily. And in the world that we work in now, where the internet is just full of stuff and people are, having had 2 years at home, they've done a lot of research on everything. I think this becomes hugely important for supply chains and businesses to be able to connect the dots between supply and demand, customer and supplier, to be able to show you can buy our stuff, it's safe, it's good, it's trusted, it's quality. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. So at this time, I want to open the floor to some questions from the, not really the floor, but open the virtual landscape to questions or people calling. So I do have a couple here. And this might be to Greg's original comment about automation, but someone would like to know more. What are some ideas about automation in this space? Where do you potentially see it going? I think you mentioned the 3Ds, so I don't know if you want to expand on that, Greg.
Yeah, so it's going to go to what each one of these other panelists have addressed here. It's going to go to the mundane. It's going to go to the tedious first, and to the dangerous, frankly. So I think I would approach this question from this standpoint. If you think about automation in the supply chain, think about what humans do well that particularly technology does not. Humans make instantaneous decisions that are life or company or business changing with inadequate or even inaccurate data very, very well, much better than technology does. So that's a very satisfying, by the way, job for an individual. To what Sandra was talking about, we don't want it to be 100 keystrokes to do something that a bot could do, to Juan's point, or to take away that ability to use critical thinking and reasoning to solve a problem, when we could have technology doing entry of invoices or whatever, right? There's robotic process automation, RPA, which I think, Juan, is what you're speaking to, where you can define a process, it just happens. It's something that a human being would do repetitively, right? The kind of stuff that causes carpal tunnel is perfect for a bot. So I think you want to think about automation from that standpoint. Now, there are also things that humans currently do that we are absolutely ill-equipped for, and that is consistent, repetitive, and complex roles. And that's where things like AI and other automations come in. Once the technology has learned how the process works, and very often that's from a human being, then what a technology does is it never forgets, it never gets emotional, right? And it does the technique consistently. So that allows kind of a melding of human and technology knowledge for consistency and efficiency going forward. So those are the kind of automations that I see at the highest level. I mean, there are all kinds of low-level ones, including autonomous driving and drones, and of course all sorts of other things. But
anybody else have any thoughts on the automation side?
There's one where and maybe we're slow to the game because we were on this transformation anyway. But if you, to your point, Greg, and just building on that one about complex being something that we do or don't we want, human interface on. If I look at forecasting, if you there's a habit that we develop that everybody's got to touch the forecast, and actually, if it's based on data that's from actual data, why do we want to play with it? Well, we don't trust that it's the right data, but why don't we trust? And we have this measure that we talk about, forecast value add. I actually call it fiddling value add, because it's you sort of measure what the forecast looks when you're finished, not when it starts, and then we can manage this then to say, well, did all that fiddling about really make a difference, or did it make it better or worse? And I think that's an education piece as well of, we need some people involved in the forecast, but statistical forecast accuracy and using statistical forecasting along with other elements in the planning pipeline actually works brilliantly if you let it run and your bots learn. This is true machine learning that we're talking about here. And we do stuff in the factories. Absolutely. We've got bots, cobots. We're there trying to get ahead of the game on preventative maintenance and all that sort of stuff. But I think the future is more on, let's take away the need for people to do things to what the consumer wants. And let's rely on the data from the consumer to be able to directly deliver what's needed, where it's delivered to, where it needs to be delivered to. That would be my build on it.
So it's interesting that particular point, Raj, is I had a product manager who worked on a study with Stanford University, and I'm going to quote a range because I don't remember the exact number, but it was dramatic, the impact that humans have on the forecast. And it was something like between 67 and 85% of the time, humans made the forecast worse by intervening on it. So that's a great example of something that we are terrible at. Why? Emotion, right? Memory, and lack of consistency. So particularly emotion. So I think that's a great example of something where we are better off to trust the bots, as hard as that is to say.
I don't want to digress. I agree with you. I've seen that study. I think it's always a confluence. For somebody who's worked in a large organization where the P&L leader goes, hey, what's the forecast for next year? And the CEO has already said that the streets, the analysts, we got to hit 15%.
Right. They've already told you what your forecast is, right?
You know how that goes.
Yeah.
Who do you think?
Yeah.
You can't go with what the bots are saying at 7. You're going to have to go with what the CEO is promising the analysts.
Right.
You got to get more funding. So that's a separate, as they say at that point, stakeholders, right? So we have another question, a little bit of a pivot here. Dealing with your suppliers, have you had to prop up your vendors financially in order to maintain supplies for manufacturing? So I think that's kind of extending the envelope of, hey, rather than the strategic part, but a financial viable, whether it's probably buying in, investing, or something to that effect. That's a delicate question, only if you're comfortable in answering that, and you don't have to be specific for anybody on our panel. Sandra, John, or Juan, if you want to.
I think generally the answer would be not really, because what we've done is looked at the specifics of payment. So, can we help people? Everybody's after DSO, DPO, DIOH on the cash play. Actually, in some of the places, some of the times through COVID, we've pulled back on our DPO to actually look at, and DSO to look at, okay, what should we be doing to make sure that we don't, kill who we feed and who we get fed by. That's a partnership then. And try to find a way that way. And we seem to be pretty, we do that anyway on a regular basis, but it's probably been more pronounced not significant, but probably more in the last couple of years or so, for the obvious reasons of people are trying to make ends meet. So, and we're also taking accountability for our behavior, which again is about diversifying your supply base. Yeah. So let's make sure that we do that at the same time as be fair with our people.
Yep. John or Juan, any experience in that? And once again, I know it's a delicate question, but if not, go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, I don't have anything significant to add, but yeah, I think Sandra kind of nailed it. We're doing a lot of the things that we've always done, but doing it in a more nurturing way and in a more creative way with most of the suppliers, as well as ensuring that we do what we need to do, meaning that if we're not approving invoices timely, tightening up our internal processes to be sure that if there is any issues caused by us, we're really correcting those and doing the right thing with our suppliers.
No, I appreciate that one. And Sandra said something that really caught my ear, and it's kind of ironic. In the fourth and third quarter, I also part of a number of diversity organizations and diversifying our portfolio through a number of depressed areas that never had a chance to participate in the game, women-owned suppliers, women of color. And one of the things I had, and this is my previous life, but I worked very closely with legal and contracts and procurement. And I'm not saying this happens with anybody here, but some of the things that have happened is when we're at 90-day pay terms, asking for $5 to $10 million of insurance on people who aren't in the direct side, or asking, draconian measures. And it's something that, as large organizations, we have to be mindful of. You have a supplier diversity arm, you have legal, and you have procurement, and you got to work. What I might do with Microsoft, I can't do with a small mom and pop shop a woman of color down in Atlanta that I'm trying to bring in. So those are things, and it's kind of something I'm telling the whole audience that I kind of work through on a day-to-day basis with a lot of our clients and trying to, well, Raj, no, that's how we've always. And I'm like, well, you're telling me you want to go to the $1 billion roundtable of diversity, but you're going to not pay somebody for 90 days. That's not working. And I could speak firsthand. I owned indirect sourcing for GE for many years, and GE was notorious for the 90-day pay term. But I can say that since that was a long time ago. But anyway, I know, Greg, I see you nodding.
Well, I've seen the full spectrum from completely altruistic to literally investing in or providing capital to supplier to being completely opportunistic and charging your suppliers, a finance fee to pay on your agreed terms. And, the usual suspects are the ones who would do that. Some of the largest retailers in the world. And it is, by the way, that is kind of a unique to retailer tactic. Honestly, I've been on, again, both sides of that and felt horrible from both sides about it. But there is a lot of goodwill being built among these suppliers. And believe me, let me assure you, it doesn't matter how big you are, there comes a time when it pays off, or if you do the alternative and are opportunistic, it pays you back. So it's better to pay it forward than to get payback from your vendors down the road. That's just kind of what I've learned over the years. And I think there has been a lot of soul searching, let's call it, from organizations like we're talking to today, who have at least tried to shore up their services. They're not doing anything intentional to harm their suppliers, but there are gaps in their process that they have closed, or to Sandra's point, they've gone, okay, we can live on less for a little while. Let's support the suppliers and boost their cash flow, or maybe even to the detriment of our own. Who knows? But the first thing you have to recognize is you have to remain a viable customer to your suppliers, because if you go out of business, they go out of business.
Exactly. Well put, Greg. One more question here from the audience, and then we'll begin to start the close of our discussion today. Asked, coming back to technology, data analytics, do you feel that various actors across your supply chain have the information they need to do their job effectively? That's the first part of this question. And are you able to make changes to your supply chain quickly enough to keep up with the changing market conditions? And then finally, this person had 3 parts. So
wow.
And lastly,
that's like a 60 minutes question.
Yeah, exactly. And then are there opportunities for technology to help the supply chains be more nimble? So if in effect I hear this, I think you guys talked about where technologies can make it more nimble. But I guess, and I think John also did mention about the leveraging of data. So I guess, for Juan or Sandra, if you guys want to talk about data, and then finally, are you able to make changes quickly enough to keep up with market conditions? So if anybody wants to take any part of that question, feel free, or I can read it again.
No, I think John took himself off mute. I was going to say, maybe John has a point of view.
Yeah, I do. So I'd say, I think that people have the data they need to make decisions within their silo. But when they're trying to look at things more holistically across the organization or different parts, then it's hard to pull that data together. So I think that there's a hole there. And I think that we're working to address that holistic visibility from supply to delivery to customer. So yes and no, to answer that question. And then in terms of being able to quickly respond to things, I think you can only do that if you've put the people, processes, and technology in place already to be responsive and resilient to shock. If you haven't designed your supply chain for that, by the time you react, it's too late. It's going to be 6 to 12 months before you can really steer the ship on a different course, unless you've already intentionally designed for that level of response.
Anybody want to add to John's or pivot or discuss what those questions were? Okay. If not, why don't we do this? It's been a fantastic discussion. I mean, I've been capturing notes here left and right, and I'll break it down at the end. But the last question I want to leave you with, and I know as we were prepping, we were discussing how far are we along the way? Do we still have 4 to 6 months to go? Do we have 6 to 12 months? Do we have 12 to 18 months? So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but as we're going through this 2022 year, what are your key initiatives as a supply chain leader, and what would you designate as success by the end of the year? Just that. What are the key things you want to work on, and what would you, if we have this conversation the end of the year, what would you say would be successful? So, John, we could start with you.
Yeah, I think there's 4 things for us. One, we're going through a major supply chain network transformation project in North America, where we're moving from mostly national distribution of our products into more regional distribution and kind of diversifying our base, pulling our businesses together into common DC locations, building full truckloads instead of LTL shipments. So that's one. We've already talked about SKU rationalization being critical. That's something that we're going down the path on well. We still have a lot more work to do. And that ties in with forecast accuracy. So, there's an assumption that the future is going to be a lot like the past, but which past? Is the last year the new normal, or is that an outlier? So we need to get better at forecasting and being able to understand what our customers want, when they want it, where they want those products. And finally, I think we mentioned before, how do we get products into our network? What's the best way to bring it from our plants, from our overseas suppliers? There's just so much cost, such a long lead time in many cases to get the products in. So whatever we can do to be more efficient with that, we've got to pursue that now.
Thank you, John. Sandra?
Yeah, so I think it's around for next year as well. I don't think this is going away this year. I think it's around for next year too, because inflation is, I've never known it in the 30 odd years I've been in supply chain. I've never known all of this to come together in such a way. And I'm not even talking about what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia. This is just generally, before that, we were all going, what the hell is happening? This is manic. So I think it's here for a while. So we have to get used to. So what I'm working on is the stability of the conversation to understand what can we do and what can't we do. Because like most businesses, you have your algorithms that you need to deliver financially. And at the same time, they may not apply to the world today. So, what kind of conversations do you have to have internally to create the space for success for the people who are just trying to do their jobs? That really is how I would call it for what I'm trying to do in supply chain at the moment. We're in line and in partnership with the business units. Of course, that always works. But what do people need to understand? And actually, last year was a really big learning year. I used a lot of that to sort of educate people on what supply chain does and educate people on why some things are, like PNOC. Why did it suddenly go mad? Well, here's the things that impact on PNOC, and there's only so much you can do if you're hedging and you're doing, and actually the hedging is good because it saves us, but we did a lot of education last year and into this year around what we actually do, because most people sometimes just think there's this box and it's supply chain and it will just give me what I want, and actually we get hit by stuff. We just haven't been hit by this kind of size of a big boot to be kicked by, So I also think part of my role is create that safe space for people to be able to do what they need to do and help educate the rest of the business on what we actually do.
Great, thank you. Juan?
All right, very similar, but I think I too believe that the challenge is going to go on through the end of the year or into next year. I think the next big challenge is going to be some of that bullwhip effect, and how we successfully manage through that as it happens. Right, when I go visit some of our suppliers or warehouse customers, I see the oversupply in different places, not necessarily on our side, but from other consumer goods that are out there and being stored in the warehouses. And I hear a lot of that. So I think that's going to be a challenge that we're going to face over the next 6 months or so as we work through this. But really, it's kind of managing through that as well as the pandemic and continuing to do the things that are critical for the business. So one of the big things that we have in our supply chain, as I mentioned before, is an asset right transformation that we're doing. And that's really looking at internal versus external. We're fairly far along on that, and we're moving forward. So success on that at the end of the year, being able to make that happen even during these very trying times, is going to be a very big priority for us in our supply chain. And then another area is going to be really around having those robust relationships, really recognizing and doing a critical, and I think Sandra mentioned it earlier, segmentation of our suppliers and understanding strategically and systematically where to hold those inventories coming out of this as we go moving forward. And our big priority is digitization, really understanding and getting our supply chain, especially in our planning systems, and increasing the digitization and capabilities in that space. Those are going to be our three big areas as well. Finally, I guess I can't leave out people. That is our number one priority, and really making this hybrid model work and continue to be the employer of choice, right? Really emphasizing that, and with the flexibility and driving the other things that I mentioned earlier around our people.
Thank you, Juan. That was excellent. Greg?
There is no out of this when you're in supply chain. This that we're talking about, I think that you're alluding to, is the disruption caused by the pandemic and governments, mostly reaction to creating safety or financial stability for people, right? That has had the biggest shock to the supply chain that supply chain is not otherwise prepared for. Ships have gotten stuck in the Suez Canal before, by the way. Plants have gotten shut down in Texas because of storms. Supply chain is about disruption. I was taught at an early age, the best way to be successful in supply chain is to assume everyone will fail you and build a plan to account for that. That's a dark way to think about it. But I think the more that we recognize that disruption is fundamental to supply chain, and the more that we try to attack and address the things that do happen every single day in supply chain, and instead of what I have seen some companies do, doesn't sound like anyone here, but some companies do, is they're looking for that new normal when things smooth out. But the truth is, things never smooth out in supply chain, and we've got one more thing going for or against us, however you see it. Now everyone is a supply chain expert, and everyone has an opinion on how you do your job. And there is nowhere to hide in supply chain anymore, because everyone knows that if they didn't get their Oreo cookies or their 110 quart shark-proof Coleman cooler, which I have, by the way, 6 feet long, holds about 20 cases of beer, or their Coca-Cola in the tiny little 8-ounce cans, Juan, which I have committed to only drink the little cans. If they don't get those things, they're aware, and it now impacts not just the top or the bottom line of a company. It impacts their brand equity. A company is thought lesser of for having a weak supply chain. We see it every single day, and so we have to recognize that and consume, because consumers have recognized that. It's an awareness that now that everyone has been awakened to it, will never go away.
Wow. That's why I have you, Greg. That's why I brought you on here for that. So appreciate those thoughts. Couldn't have said it better. Want to thank the panel. You know, we've for everybody who's listening today, and obviously there's going to be something that people are going to be listening to for a while, having great brands and, you know, anchor clients as Mondelez, Coca-Cola, Newell, and, you know, with John, Juan, and Sandra providing such excellent details of how they're working through a key fundamental market issue, as Greg, as you've laid out. You know, I can encapsulate it, but you really can't. I mean, the biggest takeaways to me is focus on what's most important. You heard that the SKU discussion earlier. You have to be mindful. You're going to have to make tough decisions. Supply rationalization, treating your suppliers as great as you ever had, making sure you're with them through all of this, both on the direct and indirect side, and your people. Juan, you mentioned it, the truckers, and Sandra mentioned it over and over. You got to treat your people as the highest commodity. I don't want to use the word commodity, but that resource that you have to come through these times. But I think that everybody out there, you're hearing from some of the top firms and how they're addressing this, and hopefully there's something that you're able to take away that you'll be able to take back to your organization. I want to thank our sponsors, the Coca-Cola Company, Comcast, UGA Business School, GoProcure, the Georgia Hispanic Chamber. I want to once again thank the great panel, and look for further programming. We'll be talking about supply chain, diversity, innovation throughout the rest of the year. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.